What do you see when you look up at the sky? Do you see masses of water vapor coalescing and disintegrating in and out of form? Or do you see a dragon, a pineapple, the face of a former lover? What is the scent of a rose but a seance, the summoning of ghosts from memory's boneyard? Our existence in temporal space requires us to stitch together experience from threads spun in the shimmering haze between fact and fantasy. But what are we without this essential madness than mere complex lumps of matter emerging and subsiding in and out of being? When we deign to paint the world with sentiments born of the soul, we do as the gods did before us, breathe life into dust and clay. Such glamours, when woven with a gentle and conscientious hand, might redeem the bitter with the sweet, the sour with the savory, and perhaps even soothe those neglected spirits which haunt the catacombs of our hearts.
Greetings, I'm Kyle Pierce, and today I'll be discussing the meanings and significations of Venus in the sign of Cancer. So if that sounds like something you would be interested in learning more about, stick around, because I intend on giving the full Monty on Venus and Cancer. And while you're here, why don't you go ahead and click the like button, identify the location of the subscribe button, give it a little nod, make eye contact, and slowly spiral in towards it. Not too fast, not too slow. And when you sense the time is right, show that subscribe button what you're made of, and click it. Now, without further ado, let's dig into Venus in Cancer. So, first things first. In order to establish a sort of baseline capacity for Venus in Cancer, we want to take a look at the essential dignity. While it is only one of many, many factors that you're going to be looking at, it does help us get a sort of baseline of how well stocked Venus is. How well equipped is she to do her job, right? So we know that Venus rules the signs of Taurus and Libra, so we know that Cancer's not in her own sign, and she exalts in the sign of Pisces, so not there either. However, Venus is given a sort of default dignity in earth and water signs. She speaks the language of connection, water, and form, earth. So regardless of other factors, we know that she has a sort of baseline compatibility with Cancer and a general affinity. So while the condition of the moon is going to be very relevant, since the moon rules the sign of Cancer, and will very much change and augment the way Venus operates, she'll generally have an easier time creating love, beauty, harmony, and pleasure in the sign of Cancer due to that sort of baseline dignity. Then we want to take a look at the Then we want to take a look at the Venus's dignity by bound or term. These sort of subsets of each of the signs, or you can think of them as rooms within the house of the sign, right? So there are 3 systems of bound or term rulership. I'll leave it to you to decide which one you want to use, but Venus is allotted the degrees between 7 and 13 of Cancer according to the Egyptian bounds or terms. This is probably the most commonly used, but according to the Ptolemaic terms, Venus is assigned rulership over the 20th through the 27th degree of Cancer. According to the Chaldean terms or bounds, Venus is given rulership over the 15th through the 27th degree of Cancer. And then finally, you want to consider the Decanic rulership, of which there are 2 systems that assign different planets rulership over the 10-degree subsets of each of the signs. So there's 3 for each sign. Venus is given rulership over the first decan of Cancer according to the triplicity system of Decanic rulership. And if you would like to get a more in-depth understanding of how Venus tends to show up in each of the 3 decans of Cancer, would you join me over on Patreon? You really would be surprised how much more specific and nuanced the expression of Venus gets depending on the decanic placement. Really will add a lot of depth to your understanding of maybe Venus in your own birth chart, someone you know, really add depth to your readings if you do readings for other people. So check it out. So if you're looking at Venus in your own chart, anyone else's chart, if she falls in any of those particular sections of the zodiac, she may have some extra zhuzh, a little extra strength, right? A little more potency to do her thing. She'll be a little more empowered, right? So we don't necessarily need the essential dignity piece to intuit that there's quite a bit of compatibility with Venus and the significations of Cancer. Venus is about creating connections with people, between people. Cancer is about connections between people, particular kinds of connections, but connections nonetheless. Venus likes stuff. Venus likes having things. So does Cancer. Cancer likes having stuff too. Venus is creative. Create objects of beauty. Cancer is also creative. Procreative, sort of fundamentally, but there's a lot of ways that translates to things like the arts. But it might be helpful to identify some of the differences maybe between Cancer and Venus. While Venus tends to signify how we go about creating connections between people, between ourselves and others, the types of people we're attracted to, drawn to, how we attract them to us, and create that harmony and accord between ourselves and those we desire, those that we like, right? Cancer has a specific way of going about this that is not maybe essentially Venusian. Cancer's orientation is much more towards the familiar and the safe. It has a protective instinct. It's not just concerned about creating harmony and accord between people. It's concerned about its internal integrity. It's ruled by the moon, which has significations around the body, sort of instinctual, emotional, and survival instinct to some degree. So, Cancer planets in general aren't so inclined to go out and seek out connection between just anybody. There's a sort of sizing up and assessing others that happens to make sure that, they're safe. Because what Cancer speaks to is how we deal with what is vulnerable, which is inherently our bodies. They're vulnerable, While we have our hard spots, our bones, we have a lot of squishy innards and a lot of squishy feelings inside that could be damaged or harmed if exposed to the wrong people, the wrong substances, the wrong insert here, right? So people with Venus in Cancer tend to be a little more picky about partners. This can vary to some degree. However, there's always a type. People with Venus in Cancer have a type, and they tend to be a little more cautious about who they let into their hearts, if you will. They also tend to be attracted to people who seem more familiar, right? And just the word familiar has a sort of root meaning in the term family, right? And the word family, the idea of family. And while, according to Freud, this is true for everybody, people tend to be attracted to people who are like their parents in some way. I would say that this is doubly true for people with Venus in Cancer. Cancer planets in general speak to a set of responses and a way of relating to the world which is formed in childhood, that sort of early developmental stage. It is ruled by the moon, right? So the moon will tell you a lot about what those formative years were like. And so people with Venus in Cancer tend to be attracted to people that remind them in some way, or in some way resonate with early childhood idea of what safety, security, and being nurtured and taken care of means. And that can vary quite a bit from person to person. So, whatever the family dynamic was early on, those themes are going to tend to play out in the realm of relationships, both romantic and otherwise, both positively and negatively. And you can start to see a bit of a contrast between Venus in Cancer and Venus in Gemini. So Venus in Gemini tends to be attracted to people who are different from themselves. They tend to want to explore and try out different types of people, different relationship paradigms. People with Venus in Cancer tend to be attracted to people who are more like them, right? That feel more familiar. They can be, a little bit slower to warm up. They can be a little coy, a little shy maybe, Not always necessarily in an anxious way, but you have to imagine that sort of that hard shell that the crab has. Planets in Cancer are going to kind of have that shell around them a little bit. So they don't tend to approach people that they're attracted to in a really direct way. They'll tend to, crab walk towards them, right? They'll feel them out. They'll usually want to know that the other person likes them first, because they don't want to have their feelings hurt, because they are going to, tend to be a little more sensitive. Or at least that will be the nature of the people that are signified by Venus in Cancer, because often the Venus placement will describe you to some degree, to the degree that it describes people in your life and your way of relating to them. Sometimes they will describe other people more specifically, especially if it's, wrapped up in the 7th house. Obviously, it depends on many factors. And not to get too hung up on this point, but there's a reason I feel like I need to emphasize that component of interpretation with Venus in Cancer in particular. Not because it's exclusively relevant to Venus in Cancer, however, with certain themes I've noticed, in order to discuss them, I have to address what can be kind of a complex issue in the world, but within astrology as well, and that is the sort of gender dynamic that we kind of encounter with a lot of traditional interpretations in astrology and how to apply them. Okay, ran into a bit of a camera malfunction, but carrying on, where was I? Yeah, so obviously we don't live in a world where gender and sexuality fall neatly into a clean binary paradigm. However, traditionally, Venus was associated with women, and given that it was constructed, within cultures that were predominantly patriarchal in nature, Venus's placement was used to describe the relationship one has with women specifically, with a sort of baseline presumption that you were a man. Because for most of history, if you were studying astrology, becoming an astrologer, you were probably a man. But, whether you were born or identify as a man or a woman, depending on what Venus is doing in your chart or your sort of cultural context for interpreting Venus, often Venus can describe a person's expectations around female sexuality. It's something I notice a bit more with Venus in Cancer. And it ends up being this sort of interesting counterpoint to Venus in the sign just preceding Cancer in Gemini, where you see a lot more nuance and non-categorical expressions of gender and sexuality. Venus in Cancer will often have this quality of describing an expectation of relationships between cis men and women, where women are supposed to be passive and submissive to men and be sort of shy and discreet and not overtly sexual, right? Until you put a ring on it, right? Which even in cultures that had that expectation was not actually the practice most of the time. However, it becomes relevant with Venus in Cancer as it tends to play into some of that dynamic. It does tend to describe, in some cases, men who have that expectation of women, or women who have that expectation of themselves, but probably more generally has that sort of traditional construct sort of loaded in to the approach to sexuality, really regardless of the gender identities of the people involved. So you'll sometimes see, say, like cis women with this expectation of themselves, as well as this idea of men being more active, more assertive, and even almost like traditional concepts of masculinity sort of woven into what they are attracted to. Like, say, men with, square jaws and broad shoulders and a big rug on their chest, right? And likewise, for maybe cis men, this expectation of women as passive, polite, sort of caretakers, and mothers, right? And often an attraction to women with big old boobies and like a voluptuous figure that sort of fall into a traditional feminine archetype, right? And honestly, what I think is that it has less to do with any objective reality about what gender or sexuality is. It's just that Cancer speaks to tradition, to ideas and ways of being that are inherited. And if you live in a culture and a society where these ideas and expectations of men and women are the dominant reality, and you have planets in Cancer, those are likely to be relevant to the way those Cancer planets engage in the world. They may be rebelling against it or trying to evolve around it in some way, but essentially just whatever the familial pattern, the tradition or culture has developed or instilled as a sort of norm or standard, Cancer's sort of home to that. So it's always something to consider when you're interpreting Cancer placements. So, it can be something to consider, if you see somebody with Venus in Cancer, on their ascendant, right? It will tend to describe a general quality of that person that may be expressed differently and may sit more comfortably or less comfortably depending on in a way relevant to the expectations placed upon them according to the gender assigned to them at birth. But with that out of the way, maybe we can just talk about what some of those qualities are, which essentially are an aesthetic appreciation of the world that is rooted in those feelings of familial or sort of clan connection. Cancer is kind of interesting because it will describe that dynamic within a family, a nuclear family, we'll say, where you got parents and siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, people that are blood relatives. And then you also have sort of cultural family. And you'll see ideas of like race and ethnicity in Cancer. These sort of different ways of organizing people according to whether or not they are familiar, whether or not they are allowed within the many layers of Cancer. There's a layer, we'll say a shell, that only family goes into, or only romantic partners go into. And then maybe there's one that the friends go into. And there's maybe one that your neighbors go into, and into your, higher levels of identity. And Cancer always has this kind of awareness of where those layers are and where people are in relationship to them. So Venus in Cancer has an interesting way of encountering that, which will often kind of bring out some of the outer layers a little more, emphasize them, because the moon is primarily a little more concerned with that closer internal sphere. The people that you see immediately on a day-to-day basis, or the people around you that are potentially in support of or a threat to your survival or well-being. While Venus is a little more of it's a more extroverted planet than the moon. So there's often an appreciation of maybe wanting to raise up and beautify those things which are attached to the various components of the person's roots, right? Their cultural roots, their ancestral roots, their national roots. This is Cancer, it's not Pisces. Pisces is a little more interested in loving everyone. Cancer is a little more like, I love the people that are part of my huggy circle, right? So in Cancer, we encounter a Venus that has a particular appreciation for those experiences, objects, people that evoke those feelings of connection and belonging, security and comfort from the past. Nostalgia, right? Those things which give us that warm, fuzzy feeling that evoke, positive emotions from the past. You'll often find people with Venus in Cancer with a large collection of photographs from the past. They like, most of the time, to have pictures and maybe well-organized photo albums of different periods from the past because they have a particular love and appreciation for those artifacts which evoke those memories, those feelings. And the friendships that they cultivate are often rooted in sometimes like a shared experience of childhood. They'll often have friends from childhood that they were friends with as children, but often they'll have friendships that are based on a similar experience of childhood, whether positive or negative, or sometimes friends that remind them of people from their past. Parents sometimes, but sometimes just people that feel familiar that remind them of somebody that made them feel a certain way. And this is maybe a skill that Venus in Cancer has, that you'll definitely see when applied to art, but in general, of sort of curating an emotional experience, cultivating an environment or situation that draws out emotional experiences that connect people with their past. I see a lot of nostalgic art, or art that is centered around evoking that sort of idealized version of history, of our history, of what makes us who we are, whoever we might be in the context. And that's the thing, is that it's sort of a lunar quality of the lunar sphere, is that there is this kind of glow and distortion around the experience of things, which is both what makes subjective experience what it is, as much as our feelings about something may distort our objective understanding of it. It's also what makes anything mean anything. Sorry if I'm getting a little too deep into this, maybe, but it's maybe something just to know about planets in Cancer and the moon in general, is that they're kind of loony, right? They're, on the one hand, often able to gain a sort of impressionistic understanding of a situation or of a person based on intuition alone, like the feeling that they get from a person or from a situation. Because, that feels kind of like this, and I know what this is. I know what this is like. And that's what gives maybe Cancer planets and the moon that sort of almost psychic quality, right? But if you've ever seen a psychic, a really good one, they're usually pretty good at identifying the general theme of a situation or the sort of vibe of something coming, what something feels like, but the details are usually not that precise, or maybe only correct like 60-70% of the time. But that is the material that Venus is working with when in Cancer. It's a highly subjective version of reality, one which is prone to change as the moon is, because the moon moves through signs faster than any other astrological body. So this quality ends up being applied and comes up a lot in relationship dynamics, where they'll become very attached to people based on how the other person makes them feel, which is important and natural. In many ways is how it should be, right? Again, that's kind of described by the triplicity rulership that Venus has in Cancer. There's a strong sort of overlap with how Venus naturally does things and how things work in Cancer. But that part that is maybe not strictly Venusian, there can be a little bit too much of that, where there can be like too much of an attachment to the way a partner or another person makes the person with Venus in Cancer feel, and sometimes a tendency to pull away, sort of clam up when something makes them feel not that way, depending on, many factors. It can be more severe or less severe. But sometimes you'll get a bit of a wanting to fudge or sort of smear some of the negative edges around a person because they're attached to a particular set of experiences with that person, and they don't want to let these other experiences, these negative ones, ruin it, ruin their idea of the person for them. Sometimes that can look like staying in a bad relationship, maybe because of an attachment to the history of the relationship, or because the expectation of what relationships are based on the condition of the moon sets it up so that the person, expects pain or mistreatment as sort of part of the package. Again, not to sound like a broken record, but like whatever the story around what nurturance and care looks like for the person, whether good or bad, will describe how Venus in Cancer is going to be forming attachments with people. But one thing you can say is that Venus in Cancer people are usually very close to the people they're close to. They're prone to keeping people, once they form an attachment with them, close. They want to keep those connections. It's a bit of a, like, once you're in, you tend to be in, because once Venus in Cancer calls you friend or calls you a lover, right, you are home to them. And they want to be home to you. Venus in Cancer wants to facilitate like safe connections with people. It's often very good at making people feel safe around them, and that is often part of what makes them attractive, right? Is that sense that you know them, that sense of the familiar, that welcoming sense of being home. They're usually very approachable people, as long as you're not approaching them too hard or too fast or too directly. Again, there's that sort of sideways movement towards people that makes other people feel safe and comfortable. Like they're not going to come at you too fast or too hard or too strong, but you'll probably scare them away if you come on too fast or too hard or too strong. And it really, again, really depends on what the moon's doing, what the aspects are. But the sort of default is this kind of slow, steady spiraling in to whatever kind of relationship is going to be formed. And the speed of that movement is going to depend a lot on like what's comfortable. You're not going to make them do, anything that they're uncomfortable with most of the time. But that can also make, people with Venus in Cancer a little skittish sometimes. Again, they're kind of picky and selective. And there's a sense that, they usually have a lot to offer, right? There's a lot of love in Cancer for Venus to work with. But, it's water, right? And water can be contaminated quite easily. So you want to keep it protected. So you may have to pass a certain like series of tests, maybe. Tests which are not going to be explicit in any way. That are going to be criteria that are only known to the Venus in Cancer person. And the Venus in Cancer person may or may not be able to articulate to themselves what those criteria are. Again, it's more of an intuited and kind of felt experience. It's, if you meet the comfort test, you pass on to the next layer. And it becomes maybe an interesting and relevant dynamic that comes up with Venus in Cancer is, Venus is about pleasure, right? Things that are enjoyable, things that are pleasant and fun, which is generally compatible with Cancer. But Venus maybe becomes particularly averse to pain, particularly physical pain, but emotional pain as well. Good at making and holding space for other people's emotional pain, but very sensitive and likely to react strongly, either internally or externally, to perceived slights or insults or particularly physical aggression. That quality can be turned on its head in some cases, as I'll end up getting into more in the exploration of Venus in each of the 3 decans of Cancer. Marquis de Sade had Venus in Cancer, and it was in a conjunction with Saturn in Cancer and square Mars in Aries. Marquis de Sade was a Scorpio rising, and if you're unfamiliar with Marquis de Sade, he was a French nobleman in, off the top of my head, 17th century, I want to say, 18th century, who you would call a philosopher, wrote extensively about his ideas about sex and pleasure, his idea of what that was. And that idea centered around the inflicting of pain. And the Venus in his chart did describe what he found pleasurable, but what he found pleasurable was how much Venus in Cancer didn't like what was happening to it, aka the square with Mars and the conjunction with Saturn. So that sensitivity, always a factor, but can mean different things depending on other factors in the chart. Now, one of the things that Venus will signify generally, or one of the things that Venus will serve as a role in, one of the things that Venus will tell you in a birth chart is it's an overall signifier of wealth. And just by virtue of having, triplicity dignity, we know that Venus will have an easier time acquiring wealth, right? Acquiring money, because money is the means by which we acquire things that we enjoy, things that we like. And Cancer, likes acquiring things, right? Its orientation is more towards comfort. But with Venus there, she becomes a sort of collector of objects of beauty and pleasure, which are often sort of artifacts that carry with them feelings of, nostalgia, sentimentality, wonder. And they'll often have a collection of some kind. People with Venus and Cancer usually like to collect something. And often those collections can be quite quirky, because Cancer is a rather quirky sign, because it speaks to all those little peculiar and particular experiences that we have, and the way we experience them through that sort of lunar lens. It sort of smears and smudges things around our subjective internal experience. So you might see somebody with Venus in Cancer with a collection of wooden clown figurines, because those wooden clown figurines mean something very particular to the person with Venus in Cancer. But they also like to collect and acquire things that will make their home beautiful and comfortable, and often, carries with it the power to do so when supported by other factors. So generally good for money, sometimes really great for money, because Cancer is low-key a rather capitalistic sign. The moon is very interested in acquiring things for itself and for those part of their sphere. So not necessarily with regard to fairness to people that lie outside of that sphere. Look at the birth chart of the United States. Got a big old Cancer stellium, Venus in Cancer, among that stellium. And one of the many things that the United States is a capitalist nation that has acquired a lot of wealth. Some might say hoarded it at the expense of others. It's not necessarily a dig right at Cancer. It's just what Cancer does. Just what any creature does, right? They acquire and gather as much as they can to ensure their safety, ensure their security, ensure that they have the things that they want and need that will allow them to multiply and be fruitful. And it's not that it's, directed at, like, being the other person over. It's just concerned with its needs and the needs of those close to them. So you'll see Venus in Cancer often in the charts of rather wealthy and successful people. And sometimes it signifies the inheritance of wealth. As Venus being a benefic, denotes a certain amount of benefit from family, from one's roots or lineage. There is often a strong positive relationship with one or both parents or a family member, sometimes the entire family. You can often be quite close with their family. And even if they're not, they long for that close familial connection, that sense of family, and will often seek to cultivate that in other ways, through a friend group or through involvement in a kind of community, or sometimes a professional sphere, or a close-knit sort of cohort related to their work or some other area of life. But you'll often see a family of some kind, whether a blood family or a family cultivated by choice. And there will often be financial benefits from those connections. And if not financial, then material in some way. You might just get like really cool stuff. They usually enjoy the exchange of gifts. They will place a lot of meaning and significance around the gifts that they give and the gifts that they receive. They may or may not be all that great at it, or depending on other factors, but will place a lot of stock in the exchanging of gifts. Let's see, Venus will also tend to provide favorable testimony for matters pertaining to fertility. Generally good for providing both the capacity to generate children as well as the activities which result in the generation of children, right? Venus is pretty strong in Cancer, so will generally grant its natives the ability to attract romantic relationships and partners, as well as produce children from those relations, right? Will tend to produce healthy offspring as well, and the children will often have Venusian qualities. Venus wants to create a family which is, both internally enjoyable and that will produce the sort of emotional, sentimental treasures that Venus in Cancer desires, but will tend to want to at least try to produce a family which is aesthetically appealing from the outside, right? Whether or not the substance of the family dynamic is particularly positive or not, Venus is going to tend to want to beautify and improve the public image, at least, and maybe emphasize the quality bits more. So people with Venus in Cancer will often have good family relationships, families that they are proud of, that they enjoy, or it will at least have enough material to create a sort of Facebook version of a beautiful family, right? Venus is going to do her best with whatever the moon delivers to her in Cancer. And will often try to salvage or redeem maybe some of the damaged stuff that gets delivered from maybe a poorly placed moon. It's generally a good placement, right? It's a benefic, it's strong. You'll often see Venus in Cancer in the charts of artists, musicians, actors, performers who are creating art or literature, etc., derived from experiences of family, whether positive or negative, especially negative, because that's what we all really want, right? We want to see the messed up stuff, but we also want to see Venus redeem it, make it beautiful, make it compelling, bring us into the experience of it, make us sympathize and empathize with characters who maybe have difficult experiences, or really whether difficult or not. She wants to connect people with a subjective experience, right? Cancer describes a very personal experience of life and reality, right? Nobody knows how your life feels except for you. But Venus wants to maybe bring that story, bring those experiences into harmony with other people, make a cool movie out of it, draw a picture, write a story that conveys that very personal experience to other people in a beautiful, uplifting, redeeming sort of way. She's often quite good at that, but sometimes interpersonally can become frustrated when other people fail to appreciate their personal experience of something. I should say that people with Venus in Cancer really want to be understood. They want to have their feelings understood by other people, and while generally good at making that happen, it is fundamentally not entirely possible to convey entirely one's personal subjective experience onto another person. So sometimes it can be a sore spot, it can be an area where some unrealistic expectations can exist, and sometimes they'll have, unrealistic expectations of their ability to understand other people's subjective experience. And sometimes they'll want to create harmonious accord through the mutual exchange of subjective experience to the degree that it can make another person a little uncomfortable, or maybe they're not willing to share everything, right? And that can be sometimes difficult for people with Venus in Cancer, because there's almost an internal sense that harmony can always exist as long as we understand how the other person is feeling, and we both acknowledge and sort of experience each other's feelings, which when supported, or at least, not challenged by other factors in the chart, can be very positive and very good and healing, can definitely support positive relationships. But sometimes, there can be issues around that emotional exchange. Because Venus Moon, is generally compatible, but there's a bit of tension there, which generally revolves around the public and the private. Venus wants to share. The Moon will share under specific conditions, but it's careful about who and what it shares with. Venus is inherently more social than the Moon is. So there's sometimes some tension around the idea of privacy. You will often see generally a tendency to want to keep the details of the personal relationships more private, sort of away from the prying eyes of the public, which is not unfair or unrealistic, right? Though sometimes, that can, especially with more public figures, can be hard to avoid. Typically with Venus Moon stuff in general, but with Venus in Cancer, you'll see the theme around sex, sexuality, and privacy intertwined in some way that is inherently uncomfortable. Not always uncomfortable to the person, but to other people sometimes. I know that sounds very vague. Try to get more precise. The sort of default is that Venus is inherently a sexual being, right? Venus is a sexy planet. It's interested in sex, being sexual, among other things. It is not inherently private or shy or shameful about it, right? It's not indiscriminate, right? But it's a good, healthy, strong Venus, say in one of its own signs, is not worried about the judgment of people outside of their connection with the people they're connected to any serious degree. it'll be respectful of society and the social expectations, and he doesn't want to offend anybody, right? It's not necessarily going to go out of its way to keep its affairs private. It's just not. It's not like part of like archetypal Venusian consciousness. It becomes part of how we do Venus and expect Venus to be done, due to cultural ideas and in an astrological sense, the influence of other planets, maybe. And Venus is equipped to deal with that stuff. But that's a rather long-winded way of saying that Venus in Cancer is inordinately private, or dealing with the topic of privacy as it pertains to sexuality and relationships. And sometimes you'll see it just like that, like private about those topics. But sometimes you'll see those topics externalized and brought into the public in a way that is sometimes uncomfortable for the person or uncomfortable to other people. And usually not in like a really loud, overt way, except in some extreme circumstances. But Venus in Cancer will sort of like to draw attention or attraction of others through this sort of allowing little peeks behind the curtain, if you will. If we're in the early 1900s, it's showing a little ankle, right? Revealing maybe just a little bit more than should be revealed. Be bringing a little too much sexiness to an arena that should be a little more wholesome and family-oriented, if that makes sense. I think it should. Most of the time, it's quite a subtle paradigm for individuals, but when supported by other factors in the chart, it can be a big topic and can play out in rather interesting ways. But sometimes you'll see Venus in Cancer in the charts of people who play with those expectations a little bit, as there's a way that Venus sort of takes on those lunar qualities and characteristics, that's sort of spiraling in towards something, that's sort of giving you a little bit and a little bit more and then a little bit more, right? There's a way that it can do that in a way that is provocative, right? It's one of the ways that that Antisha that I talk about a lot, if you've listened to me talk for any amount of time, Venus in Cancer, rather, the sign of Cancer and the sign of Gemini have an antitial relationship, being equally distant from the summer solstice point. The length of night and day overall for both signs is equal. And it becomes more relevant if you say have a planet at 10 degrees of Gemini and a planet at 20 degrees of Cancer. They are equal in terms of their day-night cycle and have a weird sort of mirroring of each other. That's why they're very different signs. There's ways that they're kind of similar. And you'll see that with Venus, say, in Cancer and Gemini, as wanting to play a little bit with sexuality in a way that sort of tantalizes or teases or provokes, a sense of anticipation or expectation. Gemini, it's the giving you a little bit to let your thoughts run wild, generate possibilities from the little piece of data or skin that's been revealed to you. With Cancer, it's a little more of a building anticipation through expectation and that sort of sideways approach. Venus in Cancer tends to enjoy and to some degree require that sideways approach. Doesn't tend to like overt. I'll say like Venus in Cancer doesn't want to just go straight to the money shot, right? It doesn't want to cut to the chase. It wants to enjoy the sort of meandering stroll towards the big reveal, right? Venus in Cancer wants to be warmed up a little bit. I think that is enough for now, and you can join me on Patreon to get even more in depth with Venus in Cancer as we go through Venus in each of the 3 decans. We get to know her particular qualities in each of them, but sort of through that discussion and kind of compare and contrast, we get to know a lot more about Venus in general in the sign of Cancer. So I hope to see you there, but you can also help support the channel by just hitting the like button, subscribing, and especially sharing it with people that you know, that you like, that you think might enjoy or appreciate this kind of content. can also consider making a donation through my Ko-Fi page, and you can also book a reading with me through my website, KylePierceAstrologer.com. You can find links to all of that in the description below this video. And if you want to learn more about the Decans, come join us on the Three of Wands Discord channel, where, among other things, we have a Decanly discussion on whichever Decan the sun happens to be in. We have a really just awesome community there. Anybody is welcome to join. It is absolutely free, and we would love to see you there. In other news, I will be attending NORWAC this year, so I will be closed for consultations be May 25th through May 30th. But if you happen to be attending NORWAC as well, come say hello. I'd love to chat, to meet some of you wonderful people who are the reason I bother to do any of this. And what else? I know I have probably something else that I need to promote or share or something, but hope to see some of you guys there. In the meantime, I would love to hear some of your Venus in Cancer stories. Do you have Venus in Cancer? Do you know someone with Venus in Cancer? Or do you have an interesting Venus in Cancer transit story? How has Venus in Cancer showed up for you in your life? I would love to hear about it. So please share in the comments. And thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.